schön, dass Sie zahlreich gekommen sind. Wir haben heute den letzten Abend in unserer Novemberreihe. Nochmals vielen Dank an die Sto-Stiftung, dass sie uns erlaubt, dieses zu organisieren und es auch finanziert. Wir hatten in diesem Jahr das Thema Ressourcen. Interessanterweise kann man das Thema Ressourcen natürlich auf verschiedene Art und Weise interpretieren. Wir hatten ja angefangen mit Architectus, die sehr interessante Projekte gezeigt haben, wo die Ressource das Material war, die einfache Verwendung des Materials. Wir hatten Olga Alexakova da, die uns berichtet hat über das Mangel an, nennen wir es mal, politischen Ressourcen, die es überhaupt ermöglichen, Planungen zu machen, also diesen Konflikt, dass man natürlich auch bestimmte prozessuale Situationen haben muss, um vernünftig planen zu können, und die diesem Konflikt arbeitet und wirkt, jetzt nicht mehr in Russland, sondern außerhalb. Wir hatten beim letzten Mal Kerstin Müller, die das Thema Ressourcen auf ihre Art und Weise interpretiert, dass sie mit Ressourcen Architektur macht, die schon existent sind. Und heute freue ich mich sehr, dass wir Amin Taha haben in unserer Runde, der das Thema Ressourcen auch nochmal kulturell weiter begreift und auch sich sehr der baukulturellen Komponente als Ressource für seine Projekte widmet. Ich will ihn kurz vorstellen. Amin Taha ist in Deutschland geboren. Ne? Überraschung, deswegen spreche ich auch die Introduction in Deutsch. Er sagt, er ist so quiet.
Sehr schlecht.
Ja. Quiet, okay. Er versteht ein wenig Deutsch, aber er findet es ganz gut, dass man mal den Sound des Deutschen hier dann hört. Er wird allerdings die Lecture natürlich in Englisch halten. Amin Taha ist also in Deutschland geboren, hat auch, glaube ich, 8 Jahre in Deutschland verbracht, die 8 ersten Jahre, ist dann später nach England, hat an der University of Edinburgh studiert, hat dann später nach dem Universitätsstudium bei Büros wie Chris Wilkinson, Zaha Hadid, waren, glaube ich, noch 2, 3 dabei, gearbeitet und hat dann später 2005 sein eigenes Büro aufgemacht. Das hieß früher Amin Taha Architects, ist später 2015 umbenannt worden in Groupwork Architects, oder Groupwork ist der Name?
Groupwork, ja.
Groupwork. Und der Name ist auch Programm. Das finde ich eine sehr interessante Szenerie. Soweit ich das verstanden habe, ist es so, dass dieses Büro allen gehört. Das ist sozusagen eine Anteilseignerschaft, ein Büro, wo alle Mitarbeiter Anteile haben, die dann immer für 5 Jahre einen Chairman wählen. Amin Taha war der Chairman bis 2020. Jetzt gibt es einen neuen Chairman, das wechselt sozusagen. Das finde ich ein sehr interessantes Konstrukt für ein Architekturbüro und ist sicherlich relativ unüblich in unserer ansonsten immer sehr autorengetriebenen Branche. Amin Taha ist, kann man sagen, berühmt geworden durch ein Projekt, was extrem kontrovers diskutiert worden ist, und es sollte abgebrochen werden in Islington. Ich weiß nicht, ob er dazu noch was sagt. Das war sogar bis zu, nach Deutschland kam dieses Thema, ein Haus, also was konstruiert worden ist und dass der örtliche Baubürgermeister wieder abbrechen wollte, dieses Haus, aus welchen Gründen auch immer, wurde ein Prozess geführt, den hat er zum Glück gewonnen, deswegen steht das Haus immer noch und ist heute als Cover auf der El Croquis, die gerade neu erschienen ist. Diese spanische Architekturzeitschrift kann ich Ihnen nur empfehlen, da ist Groupworks gerade sehr schön publiziert. Amin Taha lehrt oder hat gelehrt in der University of Brighton. Im Moment lehrt er am Royal College of Art in London. Yes.
Danke.
We're looking forward to your lecture.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming to Stuttgart.
Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for coming. Okay, best get the applause in first. Okay. We do quite a lot of talks, and I have to confess, we find it, this is a bit of an indulgence, we find it slightly terrible talking about our work again and again, this building, that building, etc., etc. And as we teach, we thought we'd torture you all with why we do it like that, and how we teach our students, and really how all of us as architects ought to be working. So the title is Etymology of Architecture, which is not new, it's not ours. And maybe I can sort of begin with Schinkel's visit to to England in the 1820s. So ostensibly he's being sent to look at the British Museum that's under construction for the museums that are going to be built in Berlin. But actually he goes with a Prussian representative as well throughout England, Scotland and Wales. And what he finds, he's rather amazed at, is the heavy industrialization of the United Kingdom and all the construction that's going on, often wholly unrelated to any neoclassical language, and done by architects who are trained, apprenticed stonemasons, carpenters, working with the new materials of the time. So that's cast iron as well as stone, timber, brick and wrought iron. Absolutely fascinated by that. He, then later Karl Bürtiker, and then obviously Semper after that, begin to investigate the idea of what are the origins of all architecture. So the neoclassical language was all its ornamentation and motifs. Bürtiker, Semper, and others later as well in France, are essentially saying what we forget is that architecture has its origins, tectonic origins, in how materials are brought together. And Bürtiker and Semper obviously telling us that there's a Kernform and Kunstform, the joining and binding and completion. So after you're putting all those materials together, they're the materials at hand. At some point they become culturally emblematic. Now the question, certainly in England at the time, we went through exactly the same questions, was, well, what is the relevance of these neoclassical motifs? And once people understand they have their relevance in the culture of that time, are they relevant to the culture today? Now, you might ask, how did that occur? Up to then, people seem to be, if in the UK, industrializing UK, people already understand that you can just put building materials together for whatever structures are necessary, whether it's new factories, warehouses, and urbanization. Why is it that there's a whole generation of architects who don't understand that? Why are they asking those questions at all? And I would dare I say, I would blame Johann Winkelmann. So Johann Winkelmann is the proto-archaeologist, art historian. His two books become the go-to place for art history. And you have to remember, he's an academic. He's not an architect. He's not trained as a maker at all, but he's an academic. But as proto-archaeologist, he's properly mapping out his findings and then, as it were, reconstructing them. His first book is a bestseller, the history of ancients, the art, architecture, history of the ancients. But then his second book is his opinions. So what he does, he conflates, in his opinion, Greek as best of all. Greek is conflated with democracy, independence, away from imperial or the rule of kings, pharaohs, and all the rest of it. It's obviously very popular at that time, the period of enlightenment. He makes a few mistakes, of course. We didn't know at that time, or he didn't know at that time, that what he's looking at is the purities, conflating the Greek architecture and its pure whiteness, as it were, the marble, with the purity of the democratic state, as it were, not realizing, obviously, it's polychromatic. What is the difference? You know, what happened before then? Well, there's some theoretician, art historian of 200 years beforehand. So before Winkelmann, we have Giorgio Vasari. And you probably know Giorgio Vasari wrote the most excellent artists, architects and sculptors. And he included himself amongst them, as you would perhaps in those days, because he was ultimately an architect, artist and sculptor. The difference between Vasari's book and Winkelmann is that Vasari is essentially anecdotal. So he's telling us each one of those individuals was an apprentice to, whether it was a silversmith, goldsmith, then going in to become an apprentice stonemason, who then learned sculpture. He'll tell you their sort of social history, where their parents came from and why they went into the apprenticeship system, and then how they became masters in their own right, did their 10,000 hours of training, and during that period, after that training, innovated and pushed forward whichever discipline they were in. So there's a distinct difference between the Winkelmann, the noun, as it were, the collective noun of a style, of a period, which is highly important in terms of a nice linear architectural history, and the Vasari definition, which is individuals. These are autobiographies. These are makers. So there's the verb, as it were, before a collective noun. So Vasari was during his period, was in debate with other people at the time, arguing that there shouldn't be a collective noun for a style. It should be the individual manner of architects, sculptors, and painters. In any case, we're in the 19th century, so we've come to a crisis as architects, as theoreticians. Why on earth are we representing the new architecture, our period, with an architecture of the Greek and the ancients? The conclusion is it should be from tectonic. Architecture should have its origins in tectonic. But they're not quite sure what those tectonic representations are going to be. It's an idea at the time. They're still not trained. None of them are trained in stone or any other materials. And indeed, they're not actually training anybody either. It's a theoretical idea. So obviously we have the closest thing, which is let's express the bolts that hold the masonry to the structure. And then eventually a sort of reconflation, as it were, of the applied arts with the arts, which then finally has an expression, possibly 100 years later, in the materials at hand. Now, interestingly enough, by that stage, the arts in literature, so this is Federico de Onís in Spain, in Madrid, who's teaching Dali, Buñuel, and Lorca. By that stage, he's already saying, why are we, how do we find ourselves perpetually going through one dogma after another? A style, the collective noun, as it were, because we're still trapped, in his opinion, we're still trapped in the Winkelmann idea of a collective noun, a style, as opposed to the Vasari individual biographies. Lyotard and Hassan picked that up, so that's the 1920s. Lyotard and Hassan, it takes another 50 years before it then re-emerges. So Lyotard and Hassan in the 70s are then picking up the idea of the postmodern condition. Which you would have thought, hurrah, 1970s, we're finally realizing it's not a collective noun, a dogma of a style that we're all having to be educated in and then reproduce. Charles Jenks is trying to express that in his first book, which was titled New Radicalism. There is no dogma in terms of the postmodern condition. And the poster boy for his book is actually Gaudi. Nevertheless, what happens, as he goes to his publisher, postmodernism has become a sort of catchword. The far left, the far right, and everybody else is trying to adopt it for their own purposes. And he's persuaded to change the title to postmodern architecture, the language of postmodern architecture. And like any other dogma beforehand, it suddenly becomes a collective noun for a style, a language, an architectural language, a vocabulary that we're all expected to follow, as it were. And of course, we are all living in a period that is the postmodern condition, and these things don't last very long. It doesn't take long, not even for a lifetime, a generation. It actually takes sort of generations of students graduating to go from one to the other to the other. And we're asking exactly the same questions again. So you might know Edward R. Ford, his interrogation of what is architecture, details. It's in the making, it's in the tectonics. He's not expressing the postmodern condition. He's not expressing a crisis in architecture, but he's expressing a crisis in its details. He doesn't understand why some architects are torturing materials to look like something that the architecture shouldn't really be. So in his opinion, there's only two legitimate types of detail. They're the articulated, which is effectively the tectonic, and then what he calls the autonomous. So a handle, for instance, a door handle, that is just doing its own thing, but it's not necessarily speaking of an overall structural theme, but it's speaking of a sort of poetic theme, perhaps, in the building. So we come to Richard Sennett and the craftsman, who effectively says, whoever you are, whether you're a surgeon, an architect, a computer programmer, a musician, you are a craftsman. You have to do your 10,000 hours of training before it becomes second nature, before you become highly skilled and professional at it. His teacher was Hannah Arendt, who, arguably you could say is Victorian come Marxist, influenced by that period, while he isn't. He's sort of counter to that. And the reason I make that distinction is because he makes the distinction. He suggests that she deliberately differentiated animal laborans, i.e. you as having to earn your own living to feed yourself, put a roof over your head, from somebody who's interested in the Homo faber. So that's man the maker. And man the maker doesn't necessarily mean making with your hands, but man the creative. And what you're doing is creating for social purpose. So you might be a politician, a theorist, but you're creating something for good social outcome. And his argument is these things shouldn't be separated. So in The Craftsman, he suggests actually all of us, and obviously we're architects here, you have an ethical duty. All of us need an ethical rudder. What is the purpose of being highly trained as a professional and going out there with no ethical social purpose? So he therefore overlaps, and we're talking to architects, he overlaps for architects' purposes our profession, our training, needing its ethical purpose, its ethical dimension. But you might ask, we live in a postmodern condition. There is no dogma, there is no ethical purpose that we should all be following, apparently. Yeah. Well, some of you might have heard of Protagoras. So he's 5th century BC Greek teacher, and he starts off in the natural sciences and observing the natural world and teaching that to his students. And what he realizes is that every time he's teaching it, they accept what he's teaching as immutable law. And his argument is it's not. I have observed that. It is my observation, my conclusion. These things around us may be immutable, but that is my definition of what I've observed. And really what we should be doing together is looking at exactly those same things, observing them, coming to an agreement when we need to on what they mean. So he swapped from teaching natural sciences to ethics, because really what he's saying is that there are some areas that there is no ethical purpose for us to negotiate anything. So if both of us walk out of our houses in the rain and one of us is wearing a coat and the other one isn't, there is no ethical purpose for the other person to tell them you must change your clothing, put a coat on or otherwise. However, if we have a social contract of some description, and he uses agriculture for instance, if we're sharing agricultural purpose, we must decide between us what time of year to sow the seeds, what time to harvest them and so on. There is a necessary and ethical purpose to that negotiation. But he says that doesn't mean it's finished. We can constantly renegotiate those, and we ought to be renegotiating them, which brings me back to what ethical direction, what's the ethical rudder? Yeah. Now, interestingly, Sennett doesn't pick up on that, and most people who deal with the postmodern condition say, well, there is no dogma, as it were, that we ought to be following. But dare I say, as architects, or anybody involved in the building industry, we can pretty much agree, and we already do agree, some ethical dimensions, a framework. You know, we could start off with, we construct together with the design team, we hand the keys over to the client, and we don't want the building to fall on their heads immediately. Maybe in 70 years' time, we decide there's a 70-year lifespan to the building when it should be inspected and see whether it needs any more work. It must not burst into flames. Yeah. It must not lose heat so much that they're burning so much energy that they're going bankrupt. It must not bankrupt them on day one. You've overspent and bankrupted them. On and on and on. I think we can all agree those. I don't think they're going to be in dispute. And of course today, the embodied carbon should be kept low as well as its energy use. Beyond that, what does it look like? Do we have to agree what it looks like? Well, if it's somebody's private property, just like Vasari's two men walking out in the rain, who are you to tell anybody it should look like this? Yeah. So in the UK, and you touched on it, we have conservation officers. Yeah, that's what they're called. Conservation officers who tell you you must conform, you must fit in, you must respect. This is a language that was developed in the 1970s that hasn't quite developed any further. And to us, the results are a self-fulfilling prophecy of an urban realm of fakery. Because really what people are doing is the expediency of just getting their planning approval. They're looking to what they're being guided to follow, and their neighbor has followed something they followed the year before or the year before, and you can see it's a watered-down version of the original that might be 150 years old. It's slowly but surely watered down more and more. And you think, well, nowhere else in life do we have officers for music, officers for painting, officers for medicine and science telling you, you must not innovate, yeah? You must not change. So to us, the argument is set aside the appearance altogether. Right. A building, perhaps. So let's start off with Caroline Place, which is a very straightforward house, design, dare I say, rather charming and pretty inside. But the reason I put it up is because the stone staircase introduces us to stone. All the way up to the post-war period up to the 1980s, late 1980s, we'd forgotten how to build what are called reciprocal staircases. So one step rests on the other, and it takes the load down to the landing, to the floor plate. The step is keyed into the wall to stop the step twisting. Sounds very straightforward, but somehow we'd forgotten. In fact, it took an engineer to work it out, Price and Myers to work it out in the late 80s. And we were looking at a building where the staircase had to come out, a new one brought in, and of course the solution is steel stringers or concrete, and then you can put a sort of stone cladding across it. We asked English stonemasons, how do you make the original? It's impossible, it's so expensive, the technology's gone. Yeah, but the engineers worked it out, it's just this system. No, nobody knows how. In France, they still train stonemasons not just in decoration ornamentation, but actually how to make this stuff, yeah? How to make stone, dimension stone is called, cut out stone, a superstructure as well as this sort of thing. And of course it turns out not to be that expensive, it's just stone, cut out the quarry, put into place. So it was a learning exercise for us. So our first understanding of, if you like, of the tectonics of things, where you make the outcome irreducible. So you probably know in chemistry or physics, you basically make that element irreducible. There's nothing you can take out of that staircase. You take any material out, the staircase won't be there. Yeah? And some of you will know if you practice classically, every building, I mean certainly in the UK, the cost consultants will tell you, yes, we're ready to go out to tender, and you go out to tender and it always comes back, never comes back on budget, never comes back under budget, it's always over budget, isn't it? And immediately afterwards you have to do what's called value engineering, and they reduce, just take things out. And you're scratching your head thinking, how the hell did we put that stuff in the first place if we don't even need it? So our philosophy was, let's try and make everything irreducible and see if there's a beauty that comes out of it that just speaks in its own way. And obviously that's our definition of beauty, that it follows that ethical framework, and that's the outcome. It is not a beauty of proportions necessarily, or learnt, adopted language definition. And while we were in the stonemason's yard, these large blocks come in. We're looking at those while we're looking at buildings that are going on in London, thinking what It's just a giant block of stone. It could easily act as a piece of structure. Why are we building things in steel or concrete and cladding them? So we did a bit of investigation in stone structures, and all the way up to the early 20th century, late 19th century, especially again in France. By the way, stereotomy just means how to project a drawing onto a cutting mat, as it were, how to cut your stone, so your load path in the stone hits the ground efficiently. And you can see there, fantastic, especially on the bottom right, that is effectively a flat soffit that you're looking at, made of small cut pieces of interlocking stone that then take the load path to the ground. Now, inevitably, steel and concrete frames are far more efficient, easier, quicker, cheaper to build up. But it tells you it's possible. And this is obviously the way we do it today, on the whole. Dare I say, pre-oil crisis, we built in a certain way because we didn't need to worry about it, and suddenly energy use became important, so we insulated and put double glazing in, and at the moment now, embodied carbon is critical, and we're realizing there's quite a lot of stuff going on in there. Do we actually need it all? Can it be reduced? And for us, it's not just about reducing it, but it's a lot of drawing, a lot of potential for error as well. So, jumping about a bit here in terms of materials, but this is a low-cost housing project in central London, very small, which is entirely made of, it had to be brick in the conservation area, but again, we said we're not going to follow the exact brick rhythm that they expected us to. Why don't we use brick really for what it's intended, as a piece of structure? So what the brick is doing there is it's a self-supporting facade. So certainly in the UK, what we tend to do is hold bricks at every floor level. On shelf angles. I'm sure you do it here as well. And what does that do? It means if you've ever held some bricks, it means the superstructure suddenly has to get heavier, doesn't it? It's 4 times heavier on the perimeter bays, structural bays, than it needs to be able to hold those bricks. It's 30% more material on the overall superstructure to be able to hold those bricks. Why the hell are we holding those bricks? You can ask any engineer, and they're like, well, that's the way we do it. But those bricks, they're made in the same way as we made them for the last few hundred years. They're perfectly capable of holding themselves up several stories. Yeah, but they can't be load-bearing. Well, we're not aiming to hold up the whole building, just themselves. So it's what you call a self-supporting facade. And once it's a self-supporting facade, it's just a rain screen, really, isn't it? It's protecting the insulation and stopping the rain getting into the building. So in that case, it doesn't need to be fully bonded. And if you look at most buildings, they're what's called stretcher bond. So it's the bricks end to end, just to look brick-like, and completely solid. And then you get weep holes and vent holes and all the rest of it. There are, again, opportunities for failure. So really what we're looking at is a building that's entirely cross-laminated timber, where the interior, there might be a detail here, if I can get it to work. And there's some internal details which are sort of hark back to the Edward Ford autonomous detail. Yeah, no, I was hoping there'd be a construction detail. Okay, I might have to go manual. What you're looking at is the superstructure that's holding up the whole building. Floors, walls, roof are all cross-laminated timber. You have to do a floor build-up to get your services and heating in, but otherwise leave everything else exposed. And what that did, if you don't put any aluminium battens, partitions, plasterboard, paint, architraves, and all the rest of it, you just live with that. What that does is reduce the construction cost, not only in material, labor, but also time. So you're saving about 4 months on this particular project. I reduced it by about 20–25%. The client's very happy. But the agent for the client saying, look, no one will come into this building because it looks like a Swedish sauna. And we said, look, the client said, I will take the gamble. If I'm saving that much, I'm going to take the gamble. If nobody comes here, I'll just paint everything white, I'll put plaster on it. But of course what happened was it's unusual for London. So actually he ended up saving 25% and then getting rents and whatever else 10% more than the neighbors. So he was very happy. Upper Street is a site in Islington that that had a gap site. It was bombed. It stayed as a gap site all the way until 5 years ago or so, and there was a very small competition held on it. And we knew this. Again, this is Islington. We're directly opposite the town hall. The councillors were really interested. One day somebody's going to rebuild the original corner that's been lost. And the competition basically said, what can we do here? And we said, why don't we rebuild the corner? Obviously not precisely, we can't. Even if we wanted to, we're not allowed to, because we have to have thermal separation and all the rest of it. But let's just rebuild it as a monument. And you have to correct me here, this is where my 8-year-old German is probably misguiding me. But I quite like in English we have monument, while in German I think it's Denkmal, isn't it? Yeah, which seems quite nice and direct. And if I understand it correctly, Denkmal means think you. Yeah. So think you as you look upon me. Yeah? So we said, why don't we make it a monument? Is that correct? Some nodding. Yeah. Okay. Good. Good. All right. There's lots of murmurings going on. I think they're debating. Right, setting that aside, we said, well, why don't we rebuild it as a monument to this building that had been there? And the reason we used the word monument when we were presenting this was that what are monuments for? They're an idealization. You put something on a pedestal. It's an idealization of somebody, an ideal, something in the past. And of course, inevitably, you strip it of its anomalies, anything that's counter to the ideal. And of course, the reason that conservation officers in this borough say you must look like the past, respect the past, conform to the past, is because they have an idealization. And you ask them, well, what past are you talking about? That one. Oh, I see. So on the time scale of everything that's existed on in this area, on this site, you've decided arbitrarily to pick 1830 or something, yeah? Not 50 years before, not 100 years before, etc. You've chosen that. Yes, it's one person, yeah, who decides that. Is he an architect, architectural historian? No. But anyway, that's setting that aside. So, unfortunately, they're the gatekeepers to allow any development to occur. So if you're a client and you're just trying to build, we have to do this. I mean, okay, let's have an intelligent discussion about the idea of representing the past, or understanding the past, the idealization of it. So we said, let's make a monument of this past. And what's the problem with monuments? Well, they're stripped of anomalies, of errors. They're always an ideal. So let's choose a material that it has in itself already errors. So this is a liquid, in situ, pigmented, terracotta mixed cement, which is actually a structural wall. They're tied together. You can just about see the ties there. So they act together, and it's effectively the wall, the roof, and comes back down the other side, and everything else inside is timber. But the pouring, as we all know, when clients tell us, I want fair-faced concrete, and they expect perfect fair-faced concrete. Well, actually, concrete doesn't want to do that. The formwork wobbles a bit. It doesn't quite detach properly. There's grout loss and all the rest of it. And we told the contractor, don't worry about it. Just leave it alone. Yeah. He didn't believe us and kept on trying to correct it. So we want all those errors to be evident. In fact, we even want to contrive some errors. So we spent our time deliberately contriving errors just to keep speaking of that narrative. And then everything else internal is timber. You add the two together, and it's actually balances out. The embodied carbon balances out. And obviously, the new inhabitation punches through the old, as it were. So we're sort of representing today, not the past. a similar project. So we carried on with this theme, because obviously this is Hyde Park. There are lots of sites in these sort of areas, especially in London, and the guidelines are fairly straightforward. And while we're looking at this site, which faces south, has fantastic views of the park, and really from rising sun to setting sun, nothing interrupts you. So there's lots of potential solar gain. You're bang up next to the park. It's also noisy, but also there's privacy issues. You've got buses coming past, looking directly into the windows. While we're doing the exercise of doing the planning that we're all trained to do, we're also doing the other exercise of just looking into the social history, the local physical context, but also the social history. And we found this building by a pair of architects called Muse Davis. And today it's a hotel. And there's not a lot on it, but we found out it was actually, this is Prince of Wales at the time, before he became king, for his mistress, Lily Langtry, who was a music hall artist. And he effectively used state money to build her this love nest before he became king. And Muse Davis were very popular architects of their time. They built the Ritz Hotel as well as fairly other big urban blocks in central London. And we imagined a sort of fake history. Imagine if they had finished the whole urban block, what would that look like? And this is the way the office works. We have a number of people just thinking well before any presentations occur in parallel. And while they were making those decisions, you know, what's it made of? Is it like Upper Street, where it's a solid material, it's a casting of something of the past, a monument? Well, it's not, because this is sort of fake history. It's an illusion, a mirage, and they're beginning to think about the material being transparent. So that first slide there was an experiment on what those materials might be. And it seemed to chime with the theme that it's actually an illusion, that where our clients' clients are ultimately looking for this sort of the site, the location, the Belle Epoque ideal. So as we did that, we realized, oh, hang on a moment, that perforation can act as brise-soleil, sun shading, privacy screen, a mihrab, as well as this sense of ghost mirage of the past, as it were. This did very well. Everybody really liked it. But in Westminster, at that time, one councillor was like a pharaoh. You had to go and see the councillor. You couldn't even see the planners. They always said, don't even bother talking to us. Go and see the councillor first. He lives on the top floor. Go in the lift with your client. If he does this, forget it. We won't look at it. If he does that, you can do anything. You're off you go. And you know, it's the first time I'd ever met him. He's notorious. Everybody knows him in London especially. Apparently you should take him for dinner, preferably fly him to New York or something. This is why he lost his job eventually. Too many dinners and flights and holidays. Had I known, I would have flown him to New York. But anyway, I didn't. I sat in front of him with our client, and he suddenly realized, my God, he doesn't know anything. How on earth did he get into this position of power? He's literally knows very little about architecture altogether. He's sort of carefully asking you questions. So you have to answer carefully and hopefully guide him. And at one point he did ask, is this innovative, Amin? Historic England, which is separate, it's the central government body for looking after the heritage of the UK, like innovations. They specifically say it has to be innovative of its period, because in another 50 years' time or 100 years' time, it will represent its period. So I said, yes, it's innovative. I don't like innovation. Innovations in industry, 80% of them fail. I don't want a failure in my borough, I'm sorry. That was that. So we moved on and reused the idea elsewhere, as you would. So this is a competition we did actually win. I had to present it yesterday to exactly the same sort of board of jeopardy, as it were, but this time it was made up of experts. So there was actually about 5 hours of discussion, very, very good discussion, to the point that the chair of this board got up and he started drawing on the board saying how we might make it even better, which is fine, really. and something that we've actually built. So this is, you can see the ground floor is just still coming down, but so this is a 1960s building, which originally demolished about 8 other buildings on a high street in the jewellery quarter of central London, and gave no presence to the high street at all. So our client looked at the site and we said, look, we've done a survey of what used to be there. Actually, what was there was bigger in its footprint. It was actually taller. Clearly, late 60s, there was no land pressure here, and they built it smaller, and they put car park at the back. If we get rid of that and build out in cross-laminated timber and create a 2-story extension on the roof, we take up the envelope of the older building. And they obviously don't represent the older building exactly as it was, but allow it to slip in the same way as we did at Upper Street. Very differently, so these are discussions about a skin that's emblematic, so that semper idea that it's the completion, it becomes emblematic of a particular culture, and all it is, if you like, the Kunstform, and no more than that, and we're representing that as a perforated skin that doesn't even touch the ground, so you can see it's just a suspended idea, whether it's a mirage or solid. Another way of approaching some of these sites, conservation area sites, preservation areas, occurred at Clerkenwell. So this is an area that was just outside of the city walls of London when the Normans invaded. So it's in this location here, which had nothing on it. So the Normans, when they arrived in 1066, found a complete city wall. They couldn't penetrate it, and they effectively made a deal with the burghers of the city. They could be the new rulers of the country, but they weren't going to control the city of London. So they began to occupy the area outside, and within the same generation, the first generation that invaded, so that's 7,000, I think it is, 7,000 Norman barons. So you probably know that the Normans are actually Vikings. They'd been there for a couple of hundred years in northern France, slowly occupying more and more of France until they made a deal with the king. You can have this area, we'll call it Normandy, now you're barons, and also convert to Christianity, please. But they're still Viking in their origins. They've still got connections, family connections with Vikings who are now also in England and all the way up the North Sea, as it were. And their argument with one of the English kings, actually a pretender, and ended up in the Norman invasion. So 7,000 came over and took the entire population of the UK, 2.5 million, controlled it within a generation. After you've controlled what the Normans had, why they were partly so successful, part of the reason they were so successful is that they found that if you cut limestone out of a quarry, it's quite soft to carve. You cut it into blocks and key it together for fortifications. Within 6 months, the limestone calcifies and makes an impregnable fort, impregnable castle, compared to the rubble wall castles that were there before, which is part of the reason they occupy the land and they keep control of it. After you've kept control, you then make nice buildings, churches, and in this case, monasteries. So they filled this area with monasteries. So on our site, we have an Augustinian monastery, a nunnery, mostly in limestone, some of it in timber, which flourishes for 500 years until the Duke of Norfolk is sent by Henry VIII to dissolve the monastery and make it his own private palace. But he falls out, his son falls out with Elizabeth I, is beheaded, the land taken from him and subdivided to other noblemen until the monarchy is dissolved by Oliver Cromwell. And Oliver Cromwell takes the land and builds himself, demolishes all the noblemen's houses, builds himself a nice brick. Effectively, it's a building for government. And it's a nascent democracy, so he becomes dictator for life. He actually puts his son in charge to take over. That doesn't last. The monarchy comes back. They demolish his building of state, and new buildings are created, which effectively are for rent, which last all the way into the Victorian period. This building here, so our site is this one here, so that's adjacent to us, which was a school that becomes a library, and a printing works that William Morris uses to print what he calls then, this is the 19th century, he calls it the 20th century press. And you might know Karl Marx was one of his writers. Lenin used the printing press, and to this day it is still the center for the start of the May Day, 1st of May march. There are other, because it was outside the city walls, the rules were slightly relaxed, so it became a printing area. So this is where the newspapers started, pamphleteering, basically radicalism. And that radicalism lasted in its constant rebuilding, reconstruction, everything representative of that period until the 1970s. And then in the 1970s created this conservation guideline. You must look like a building that we've decided is roughly 1850 or thereabouts, and everything else must look like it. So when we came to present, we were told brick or stone. Yeah, we actually did some other options too, but and we said, well, actually, after that stone staircase, what's stopping us? We have no prejudice against a particular material. We'd like to learn a bit more about these materials, but evidently we're not going to build like this. So is it possible, just like that staircase is possible, is it possible to put buildings up in solid stone? Our French stonemason looked at us and said, just imagine, for several millennia, we've been building in stone and timber, and the period of steel and concrete on that spectrum timeline is this. Of course we can build in stone, but why is nobody doing it? The cost consultant said, oh, it's too expensive. The engineer said, it's not physically possible. Okay, when was the last time you costed a stone building? Well, I've never done it. Yeah, well, how do you know? Well, it's probably why nobody does it, because it must be expensive. Okay, so put that argument there. Same with the engineer. So it's a circular argument why no one's doing it. So the stonemason asked us, engineer your structure, and I will tell you how much it costs to extract the stone and lift it into place. And of course, it turned out to be cheaper than a steel frame clad. So fine, that's the answer. It's structurally possible. It's cheaper. The final question for us as architects: what's it dressed like? What does it look like? Yeah? Should it look like the buildings, the church opposite of 1790? And of course, well, we're not going to do that. But what should it look like? And we're already experimenting with finishes. When we visit the quarry, and we find in the quarry ammonite shells and quartz pockets, while the quarry master's saying, well, you know, normally I cut everything nice and clean, so a stonemason can then spend time carving patterns into it. And so what happens to the ammonite shells and the fossils, everything else? Well, nobody wants them, so I just cut them off, crush them as aggregate for road fill. I thought, that's crazy. Why can we not express that as part of the finish of the building? What you're looking at is an exoskeleton. So we were talking earlier with one of your colleagues about loose fit. So in the 1970s, there was this idea that loose fit means your clothes fit loosely. You can share them to people of any size. Yeah? Which basically means your building is not so specific that if there's a change of use, you need to demolish it and start again. It can last for several hundred years with, you know, maintenance and repair to different purposes. So an exoskeleton means that you have a central core and no internal columns. Yeah? You can do what you like with it. You can subdivide it in any manner you wish. In the future, if it's a hotel or offices, it can serve that purpose. And the final appearance, I mean, there's some details at ground level which, again, hark back to the Edward R. Ford. But they're really what you're looking at, and part of the controversy is that we didn't know exactly which column would have a fossil, which one wouldn't. And one councillor hated the idea, yeah, that one, we should know, we should predict this, and two, why is there a mixture of these, which is where the controversy started. But it was satisfactorily resolved in the end. We're almost there, but let me picking up on that theme of stone, it's cheaper. The embodied carbon is quite low. Our sustainability engineer at the end of that said, you've saved 92% of the embodied carbon had you built it in steel. So, well, how's that possible? We thought about it for a couple of days, and suddenly one of us I've got it. It starts off as zero, doesn't it? It's just sitting in the ground. It was made 600 million years ago, and all we're doing is burning energy to cut out the ground transporter and erect it. And you know, in some quarries, they're using electrical tools from renewable energy. So really, all you're doing then is the energy in the diesel. So we thought, well, okay, that's 49 kilos per cube of CO2 equivalent per cubic meter for stone, compared to 10,000 for steel. So that's an advantage that we should be pursuing. So we're experimenting with various stonemasons on reusing stones that are broken when they're made for tiles. So we're using waste, as it were. But also then, how can we replace all building elements? Does it make sense? You know, we're testing the cost as well as the embodied carbon. And what you have here is a sort of building system where the other one was exoskeleton of columns and beams. This is stacked blocks with some pre-tensioned floor plates, pre-tensioned beams and floor plates. So this is, I mean, I think this was about 14 meters, which, great, it works structurally. So we pass, and I was again talking to one of your colleagues who's saying, unfortunately, in this country, you have to follow various regulations and typical building systems, so innovation is sometimes curtailed. Luckily, we're strangely loose for all sorts of reasons. We can still do this. We can experiment, but it still has to be tested. So it's structurally tested and then fire tested. We tried to put this in a UK oven, but the oven wasn't big enough. The biggest one we could find was in Paris, which is 8 meters. So we cut that down to 8 meters, tested it in the oven. It lasted for more than 3 hours, and they said, okay, that's enough. You know, at this point, we have to shut the oven down because it damages the oven. You only need, in the UK, you only need 90 minutes. So we knew we were well beyond that. And we found out the reason why it lasted is because if it's a reinforced concrete beam, the reinforcement's quite close to the edge, isn't it? So the cover of concrete's quite small. And of course, concrete's still got water in it, and it's spalling off. The steam of it is expanding the water, and it's expanding, spalling off the concrete, revealing the reinforcement, which then fails. And similarly with the steel, various layers will eventually come off. So it did quite well. So yes, it lasts for fire. Yes, it works structurally, and the embodied carbon is about 49 kilos of CO2 compared to 10,000 for steel, and let's call it 680, 700 for reinforced concrete, depending on how much reinforcement you put in. The next stage then is to say, okay, stone and timber, because timber's sequestration. And a developer called Canary Wharf asked us, well, is it possible? Demonstrate to us that it is possible, yeah? So again, with a structural engineer, sustainability engineer, a cost consultant, we did an exercise where, yes, it works structurally, yes, it works on its cost, but what's the result? So if it's a steel frame, obviously the embodied carbon is quite large, as we know from steel, compared to reinforced concrete. If it's entirely stone, so these are the exoskeleton plus all the pre-stressed floor plates, you know, it's obviously a fraction, but if we're counting the embodied carbon of timber, it's negative, yeah? Now, some of you might have questions, I'll try and answer them in a moment. And similarly, concrete, reinforced concrete today is more expensive in central London than steel. The stone is marginally cheaper, but the stone and timber is cheaper still. So as a developer, that difference from there to there, you know, it's almost 10%, isn't it? It's roughly 10%. It's a pretty big difference for a developer of that scale. Is it innovative? Well, you know, as I've said, for thousands of years we're building in steel, in stone and timber, but obviously we're doing it differently now. You probably know, some of you might know Fernand Poulan, as well as Gilles Perrodin. So Gilles Perrodin and his son are still practicing today. This is their work. And Fernand Poulan was working in the post-war period where he found that building in stone was cheaper than steel or concrete. So his challenge was in Marseille, where he was rebuilding the docks, while Corb was on the hill building Unité, And Corb ended up spending about 10 times what this cost per flat equivalent. So, as we know, this was rarely built. It was rarely repeated. We have lots of imitators. But then this was highly successful in France. But that's another story. They cut the stone construction short for various reasons. So today you can do pretty much anything you like in stone. You just have to be careful about the amount of energy you use. And mixing it in one way or another with timber will reduce its embodied carbon. Right. Even I can feel your bottoms beginning to have pain sitting in your chair, so I'll rush through these. These are various competitions we've done recently for new buildings in stone and timber, as well as reusing older materials. So the steel in there, the intention was there's some steel on the site at the moment to reuse some of the steel internally as well. This is a competition we've won. It's going into planning. 34 stories as a stone exoskeleton. Even the interior is stone, and then the floor plates are then timber, and all the internal partitions are timber too. So with some students, we did an exercise on that building, but then we did an exercise on all its typologies. This is the last slide, by the way, so you'll be relieved. Coming back to that, your ethical rudder. Obviously, you don't want the building to fall down. You don't want it to burst into flames. You don't want to bankrupt your client. And amongst a lot of things, you might not, perhaps I would argue, should not be so obsessed with what it looks like. You should be obsessed with all these other ethical matters, and of course the embodied carbon. And with our group of students, we just listed out typical materials we were using in that particular project, and then the embodied carbon per cubic meter on each. Now, obviously, because timber is carbon sequestrating, and there's some engineers in the UK that I talk to who say, how can timber be carbon negative? And you think, bloody hell, you went to engineering school. Surely you must have done some, at least biology at O-level stage, so, which is sort of, I don't know, what's that, 16 or something. Yeah? That they've forgotten that photosynthesis disaggregates CO2. So, one molecule of CO2 is actually made of two atoms of oxygen, one of carbon. That goes into the leaf. 2 oxygen atoms are released. 1 carbon is in. What's happened to the weight of that carbon? The carbon's just vanished, like magic, vanished. But the weight of the carbon dioxide has vanished as well, because the oxygen's now in the atmosphere, and only a third of the weight of that carbon dioxide molecule is now in the wood. Yeah. So it's negative because it takes more CO2 to make the wood than the wood weighs itself. Yeah. So wood is cellulose, sugars and water, but also the carbon, and about 50-50 split. So ultimately, the carbon in there is about 1.8 kilos for every kilo of wood. So it's negative. So what does that tell you? It's like a carbon battery. As long as the wood, you've cut it, you've turned it into a piece of construction material or some other product, and as long as you're not throwing it away and allowing it to rot or burning it and having that chemical reaction again and releasing CO2, it's a carbon dioxide battery, isn't it? So we originally had them all muddled, and then we realized, well, let's put them in order, and then let's give them a color code. So in the UK, we have color coding when you go to the supermarket, and some of my friends come in for lunch, and everything they bought is red and yellow. Yeah? And you're looking at them thinking, oh my God, let's give you another 5 years or so. While other people more intuitively mix it up. Yeah? And no one's saying, don't have any red, don't eat any red. Mix it up. It's like a normal balanced diet, isn't it? Smoke a cigar, have a glass of whiskey. But if you were just smoking cigars and whiskey, you're not going to be around for very long. And it's the same with the building industry. Most of us are in the red, aren't we? The red and the red sort of orange zones. And really, if we have a thought experiment and say every building must be made out of timber, well, why not? Everything must be made of timber. Oh dear, the electrical circuitry can't be made of timber, can it? The plumbing can't be. I want a glass window, not a timber panel. Okay, I have some glass. Slowly but surely you substitute some materials. And what we found was every single building archetype can be carbon negative. And it can also be cheaper because actually what you're looking at is the structure and finishes, internal finishes or external finishes are one and the same. You're not putting a column in, putting layers upon layers upon layers, and then the finish clipped on the outside. Whether it's an external column or internal structure like the CLT, the structure is ultimately the finish. And you can have a carbon negative building. It's not always cheaper. So the only example we found was more expensive was bridges, road bridges. So there, it's still cheaper to make concrete box sections end to end and put those together as opposed to trying to use mass timber or stone. So some of you might be aware of global standard EN 15978. So that allows you to calculate the embodied carbon of any building. What it does say is, this is invented, well, not invented, but agreed across the globe around about 2017. It's 5 years ago. But at that time they said, we don't know what happens to all the timber. So anything carbon negative, we can't allow you to account for it unless you prove to us it can be reused. Yeah? And at that time they didn't know how to do that. Yeah, they said, well, what happens in 200 years' time? We're not here anymore. Yeah? So somebody might just throw it burn it for wood, burn it for fuel, or throw it into landfill. So we can't account for it. Well, since then, in Holland, you have what's called, Medasta have done what's called material passporting. So some of you probably already know that. So every single element in your building is now scheduled. And dare I say, maybe 5 years ago, it sort of did exist, but I don't know why people didn't connect the dots. We have BIM software. Every building element, of course, is already costed by a contractor. He has to buy everything, so he's got a list. The quantity surveyor's got a list. But now we've got a model that's tied in with that. Well, that model, all it needs is a column which has the embodied carbon of all those elements. You give that document as a legal document into your land, so it becomes a land covenant. So whoever owns the land in 50 years, 200 years' time, 1,000 years' time, it comes out. If you want to demolish, you promise to reuse all these materials. If it becomes a legal document, you're done. You can account for your negative embodied carbon materials, and therefore your building is officially negative embodied carbon. Now, again, as a thought experiment, what happens if all of us are making buildings overnight? Tomorrow we all go out and we're making buildings that account for negative. Yeah, what's the result? Well, what are we doing? We're actually, all that construction is actually taking CO2 out of the atmosphere, isn't it? So suddenly, the construction industry becomes a carbon sequestration industry. So we're actually part of the solution and not the problem. I'm almost done. And if you're in doubt, you're thinking, oh my God, what does he know? He's just an architect, does lovely designs, perhaps. But what the hell does he know? Well, there's a Professor Crowther in ETH Zurich and a Professor Rummage in Cambridge, who are not architects, they're proper scientists, as it were. And Rummage's study is on Europe alone. He's saying the demand of timber in Europe is already sequestering about 25% of its emissions. This is without legislation. Now, what we found in France and in Holland is that central government has said any public building must now use 30% biomaterials, i.e. timber and other things. So that's already helping to generate demand in the industry. What Crowther then widened his study and said, across the planet, there's about 1.7 billion hectares of land that was cleared for agriculture or pasture or development that's now available, not for those purposes, to be reforested. He said, if that is reforested, within 100 years, we'll be at pre-industrial levels of atmospheric CO2. You overlay those two studies, what you find is that it's not 100 years, it could actually be about 70 to 80 years, because what you have to remember is you cut a tree down. You know, if you own a forest, if anybody here knows somebody who owns a forest, a commercial forest, they don't just randomly cut trees down, they wait for a certain growth of the tree and how much bulk that tree has, and it begins to tail off, and they say, aha, I'm going to cut the tree down now and replant. It's exactly the same line for absorbing carbon. Cut the tree down, plant a new one, and you're absorbing carbon again. So you're not waiting for that plateau. And remember, forests do die, so there's decomposition, the carbon's released again. What you do is you cut, you clear, and replant, and that period of 100 years is reduced to 70 to 80. Okay, on that optimistic campaigning note, I conclude. You're released to stand up and have some blood circulation. Thank you very much. All right.